Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today we're looking at the collection for the 1995 to 1996 series Green Goblin from Marvel Comics. It all started with Norman Osborn, who was, the first Green Goblin, so it kinda had to. Gobby was originally just a villain for Spider-Man, but he would rocket his way up in importance amongst the Spider's Rogue Gallery when he learned Spidey's true identity as Peter Parker. This further led to him killing Gwen Stacy as a means of hurting his biggest foe. And in the battle following that, Norman himself would perish at the end of his own Goblin glider. But it wouldn't be long at all before Norman's son Harry, Pete's best friend, would take up the mantle of the Goblin and follow in his father's footsteps in an attempt to be Spider-Man's deadliest foe. After Harry was defeated, a doctor named Bart Hamilton would claim he was attempting to cure Harry of his insanity. But instead, he took advantage of the young man's knowledge to become the third Green Goblin himself. Hamilton would perish in basically his first outing as the Green Goblin, and for a time, the world was goblin-less. Well, except for the various hobgoblins that would come along, but they're just dumb knockoffs anyway, so not important. Eventually, Harry's fragile brain would break once more, and he'd return to being the Green Goblin. This time, dousing himself in a modified version of the Goblin formula that would give him great strength, but also proved to be what ended up causing him to die in Spectacular Spider-Man number 200. Once again, it seemed like the nightmare of the Green Goblin was over. But oh no, Marvel could see the demand for the character was too high, and what better time to introduce a new Goblin than smack dab in the middle of the start of the Clone Saga. Yes, with Peter Parker's clone having mysteriously resurfaced, giving us two Spider-Mans running around, it only seemed fitting to reveal a brand new Green Goblin to the world. And so this new Green Goblin would debut in Web of Spider-Man number 125, and then get a more central role in Spectacular Spider-Man number 225, 25 issues after Harry Osborn's tragic death, and then from there be given his own series. The collected edition for this series also contains those first two appearances in those Spider-Man comics, giving us the full picture of GG number 4. So let's find out just what those adventures are by lighting this pumpkin bomb and taking this away. The comic opens on Spider-Man! Okay, technically it doesn't, because this is Web of Spider-Man number 125, and the collection actually opens on the first issue of the Green Goblin series, because the collection lays these stories out in chronological order. Which is nice, and totally a valid way to read these comics, but I prefer to go in published order so we can start with a mystery and lead into the explanations later. So anyway, Spider-Man! Well, okay, it's the Scarlet Spider, but actually it's Spider-Man, as Scarlet is the clone. I hope to one day cover the Clone Saga in its gloriously disastrous entirety, but for now, suffice it to say that Peter Parker was arrested for crimes that he didn't commit, and Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider and clone of Spider-Man, offered to take his place in prison so that Spidey could clear his name and spend time with his pregnant wife. So for a brief time during this point, Spidey wore the Scarlet Spider costume. So again, this is actually Spider-Man, he's just in a different costume. Spidey's on the computer at the Daily Bugle doing some late night research, because this was the 90s and that's how you did that kind of thing before the internet. Spidey skedaddles out of there when a mysterious figure appears looking for its uncle, but not before Spidey managed to pull up an address for someone named Warren Miles. And wow. So that address was supposed to be readable, but you still thought this garbage placeholder text on this article down here would be okay? What, did you just smash your face into a keyboard until you had enough characters? You couldn't even lorem ipsum that shit? For shame. Dr. Miles Warren is the true identity of the Spider-Man villain, the Jackal, and was creator of the original Spider-Man clone. He was a super creepster who had become all stalkery towards his own student, Gwen Stacy, and so he had cloned her as well. Supposedly Warren and the two clones, that's a terrible band name, had all perished during the events of the original Clone Saga. But with this new Clone Saga, they all seem to be resurfacing again. And sure enough, at the address of this Warren Miles, Spidey finds a Gwen Stacy and a Miles Warren, and chases them across town as they try to run away. This ends with them getting in an accident at, where else, the George Washington Bridge, or the Brooklyn Bridge, or whatever bridge you want to call it. I don't care. It's visually the same bridge from the night Gwen Stacy died, as I showed you in my video on the death of the Stacys. Anyway, the Green Goblin shows up seemingly out of nowhere and pulls Gwen Stacy, or really the clone Gwen, because both her and this Miles are clones, pulls her from the car and deposits her on top of the bridge, where she then of course immediately falls down so Spider-Man can of course reenact that fateful moment, only this time, of course, saving Gwen. It's a moment that's gonna get reused a lot, so if you're a Spider-Man fan, yeah, you'll be seeing more of this. Clone Miles isn't as lucky as Clone Gwen, and he falls with the crashed car down into the river below and immediately dies and decays from clone deterioration, the eventual fate of all clones. At least until a future writer comes along and has need of them. Gwen and the mysterious Green Goblin both vanish by the time Spidey gets back from pulling the clone Miles Warren out of the water. But we do get a glimpse of Greenie revealing that he was the mysterious figure we saw back at the Bugle, and Spider-Man had apparently forgotten to log off of the computer, so Gobby was able to follow the address that Spidey was looking at to then follow Spidey, which is how he got involved in all this stuff. So remember kids, always log out of your computer when you walk away. Happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, everybody. We then move on to Spectacular number 225, where we see yet another mysterious dark figure, but this one is setting fire to unhoused people around New York. 10 of them by this point, according to a news report Spider-Man hears, sending him running off to look into it, now back in his classic threads. In contrast, we also get a glimpse into the new Goblin here, as he pulls on his costume, informing us that it's when he puts on his mask that he's supercharged and powered up. The Goblin heads out and seems to reveal himself to be the murderer, but before he can incinerate anyone with his festive pumpkin bomb, happy Halloween everybody, Spider-Man shows up to stop him. The two then duke it out, breaking into a nearby restaurant while the Goblin focuses primarily on just running away. But as he runs, he comes across the real killer and nabs the killer's victim and flies away while Spider-Man focuses on the real bad guy, Fire Fist. Gross. Wait, we already have one of those in the Marvel Universe. I smell copyright infringement. Well, what can you expect from a guy who talks about the unhoused like he's a pundit for Fox News? This Fire Fist has a flamethrower in his glove, which sounds like a terrible idea to me, but I guess it works for him. And briefly he gets the better of Spider-Man, burying the arachnid in some rubble. The new Green Gobby distracts his fellow identity thief long enough for Spider-Man to free himself, and once free, Spidey shifts into overdrive to easily defeat his fiery foe, while Gobby flies off into the night. That will end the Spider-Man stories, so we move on to the main series, which opens on Phil Urich, nephew of the major Bugle reporter Ben Urich, who has been a big side character throughout much of Daredevil and Spider-Man history. Ben has just finished a book on the history of the Osborns and the Green Goblin called Dynasty of Evil. Now that would be a good band name. Phil is currently working as an intern for the Daily Bugle, working directly for his uncle, because Phil's too shiftless and lazy to either finish college or get a real job. So, you know, nepotism for the win. Phil's best friend is a guy named Fast Freddy Glazer, who doesn't seem to have any job and pretty much just sits around all day and plays video games. Gotta say, these guys would be Gen Xers, but they definitely nailed the millennial generation they were trying to appeal to with that one. Also, I love that their favorite game series seems to be Mortal Wombat, which seems to be a fighting game featuring actual wombats dressed up as MK characters. Artist Scott McDaniel took his time with this series and it pays off. Freddy, though, is friends with a guy called Rico the Sicko, such a clever name, who's a neighborhood wannabe mob boss, and we meet Rico tossing a video store at the start of the series. Yeah, stealing VHS tapes. There's a crime that would totally not take an entire video of its own to explain to people today. The plot gets going when Uncle Ben has Phil trace down a warehouse that belonged to the Osborns, and in order to prove to Freddy that he's not some lame working stiff, Phil mentions the warehouse to his BFF. Only Freddy then, of course, goes and immediately tells Rico about it, leading to Phil, Freddy, Rick, and Rick's gang breaking into the warehouse for goodies on the same night that Ben shows up to investigate. And of course, Rick discovers Ben there and decides to have his men roll him. And by that, I guess I mean rough him up. Acting on impulse, Phil flicks the power to the warehouse so he can get his uncle out of there, and they split up to try and confuse their pursuers. Phil ends up stumbling into a secret room full of goblin gear and a mysterious chemical. He gets so into checking out all the sweet stuff in the room that he gets completely freaked out when he finally notices a nearby rat. He freaks out so bad, in fact, that he crashes into the vat of chemicals hard enough to break the glass, spilling the chemicals all over him. But honestly, who would be freaked out by that rat? Look how freaking cute he is. That is a cute rat. He should win some kind of cute rat award. The chemicals seem to burn Phil pretty seriously, but have no further effect on him until he puts on the nearby goblin mask. Originally, he was just hoping to use the goblin costume to scare Rico's sickos, but after feeling the supercharge he gets from putting the mask on, he takes all the equipment and attacks them head on, discovering that he's now super strong, pretty fast, and can harm people with the psychotic laughter that he makes. He'll take to calling this his lunatic laugh. As the goblin, he's quickly able to take out Rico's gang and keep his uncle safe until the cops arrive. Phil flies off into the night with his new goblin suit, pretty happy with himself and his new abilities. He even makes some mask reference. You get it? Smoking? Cause he's a guy who puts on a green mask and gets superpowers? Get it? The next issue sees Phil still considering just how dedicated he wants to be to the whole Green Goblin thing. He discovers he doesn't keep his powers once he takes the mask off, but he still finds himself inspired by various other masked heroes running around the city, especially with how they get the attention of the ladies. Thinking he wouldn't do well on his own, he briefly goes to the New Warriors and attempts to join them, because this was back when the New Warriors were still a respectable and capable group of heroes before Civil War ruined all of that. He ends up deciding he doesn't want to join any group that would actually have him as a member, but what really solidifies things for him is when his uncle takes him to meet Johnny Dare, a football player. That's American football for you weirdos out there, and one of Phil's personal heroes. Phil is really into sports, you see. All sports, which you can tell from the constant array of jerseys that he wears throughout the series. Dare is talking to Ulrich because it seems someone's trying to revive the Rose's old racket of fixing sports ball games. And Dare's trying to work with the cops and Ulrich to get the truth out there. That gets him in some hot water with some bad dudes though, and they send the Rhino to set him right. But Phil, as the Green Goblin, intervenes in order to protect Dare, and also discovers that he's strong enough to actually lift the Rhino up by his horn, and ends up dropping him to get him stuck on a dock. Phil's so impressed that he was able to defeat the Rhino that he decides to go ahead and keep being the Green Goblin, at least for now. Our next story is a two-parter tie-in with one of the Scarlet Spider miniseries that was running by this point, as a new villain named Joystick attempts to hunt down the Scarlet Spider as part of a sort of real-life video game where people are awarded points for defeating other superpowered people. You know, typical 90s stuff. Only the last person Joystick defeated in the game, a guy named El Toro Negro, happy Hispanic Heritage Month everybody, is so angry at having been defeated by a woman that he breaks the rules of the game to come after her and get revenge. Luckily for her though, Phil was keeping an eye on her due to thinking that she was super hot. And luckily for Phil, Spidey was keeping an eye on him because he figured his new goblin pal would end up getting himself in trouble. So they team up to protect Joystick, even though Joystick still tries to get in a cheap shot at Spidey while they're protecting her. Goblin convinces her to run away while Spidey webs up El Toro, and Scarlet's none too happy to learn that Goblin let the woman go. Goblin says he doesn't care, but he actually does wonder if he has a growing sense of responsibility to do the right thing, maybe brought on by this whole superhero business thing. In our next story, the Hobgoblin has come to town, and Phil is worried that it's because Hobby is angry about the pretender to the throne. The Goblin throne. That's a thing. Yeah. This is Hobgoblin number 2, as the first Hobgoblin, Ned Leeds, had died, and this guy, Jason Macendale, had replaced him. At least, that was the understanding at the time. The history of the character will get even more complicated in the future, but no need to go into that now. Phil eventually realizes Macendale is actually probably in town to stalk his ex-wife and her new husband, a guy named Van Colder, and also to hit the money train in the subway, the train that carries all the day's receipts from all the various stations, which Van Colder just happens to be giving a press conference on. Phil says this is a perfect site for a press conference, but I'm not sure why there would ever be a press conference on the money train, but sure, why not? As his green alter ego, Phil tries to stop Macendale, receiving some last-minute help from the Thing. Phil had tried to pawn the job off on the Fantastic Four earlier in the issue, expecting to not be able to handle the Hobgoblin on his own, but the Thing had initially laughed him off. Turns out he took the warning seriously enough, and with the Thing there, Hobby decides this job ain't worth the trouble and flies off. From there, Uncle Ben begins looking into a corrupt local judge named Tomb, who decides he wants the reporter silenced, so he sends some thugs to rough him up. This pulls in Ben's old pal Daredevil, who teams up with Green Goblin to look further into Judge Tomb and try to find some way of stopping him. And it's a good thing they do, because Ben isn't dissuaded from researching the judge either. So Tomb decides to permanently silence the nosy reporter by hiring a super assassin. This guy, calling himself Purge, who uses a special arm cannon to carry out his assassinations. The super duo easily defeat Purge, and in the process, Daredevil teaches Goblin the importance of saving the lives of even the bad guys. Which Phil isn't exactly buying, but he goes along with it anyway. In order to get Tomb to stop, Phil delivers Purge's arm cannon to the judge, as a cryptic warning of what will happen if he keeps pursuing Ben Urich. And that brings us to our next supervillain, the Steel Slammer. Yeah, they were definitely running out of ideas for villain names by this point, but Steel Slammer is especially lame. Maybe Superboy would think it was a cool name. I mean, maybe he'd think it's slammin'. The 90s. Slammer is easily defeated, but he's really just a superpowered distraction from the main plot, which is about Liz Osborn, Harry Osborn's widow, showing up to the Daily Bugle to demand all of Ben Urich's files on the Green Goblin, particularly the ones on the new Green Goblin, as she has accurately guessed that this new Green Goblin stole equipment from her late husband. While Ben is technically protected by his First Amendment rights from having to turn anything over, he eventually decides to give Liz everything anyway, as he knows she's a good person. This includes showing her around the warehouse where he first encountered the Green Goblin, and the group stumbles upon the same hidden room as before, only to find it now completely empty. Phil says he had been returning to the room from time to time to re-up on equipment, but with the room empty, it seems like he'll not be able to do that anymore. The purpose for this was likely twofold, both that they probably already knew the series was going to be cancelled soon, and to set the stage for the soon-to-be returned-to-life Norman Osborn. The idea being that Osborn went about gathering up loose goblin supplies to prevent any further pretenders to the throne. The Goblin Throne. I'm trying to get to a David Bowie reference, I guess. Is it working? This whole mess works out to a degree after another new villain named Angel Face, with her two lackeys Salt and Pepper, because they can't keep a single theme going in their own group, I guess, decides to go after Liz and her money. Phil had already made plans to meet with Liz, though, deciding she deserved an explanation about why he was using Harry's old gear. And he's able to rescue Liz and her son Normie from the villainous trio, earning him Liz's blessing. During the fight, Angel Face burned her own face on some steam, and blaming the Goblin for her disfiguration, she will later in the series return to go after him directly. To do this, she kidnaps Phil in order to get to Ben Urich, for much the same reason that Liz had gone to Ben earlier, assuming that since he knows the most about the new Green Goblin, he'd probably be the guy to ask about how to find him. Phil instead points her to another reporter named Ken Ellis, but when Angel Face grabs Ellis, she also kidnaps a girl named Lynn Walsh. Lynn's another intern at the Bugle that Phil has a huge crush on, but she's only really focused on her career, even though literally all we'll see of her is Phil crushing on her. Another intern named Meredith seems to be into Phil, but he barely notices her with Lynn around. Typical. Phil is able to escape from Angel Face and get into his goblin gear for a second showdown between the two of them, and once again, Angel Face essentially defeats herself when she shoots some exploding barrels and blows herself up, which every gamer out there knows is totally a thing that really happens. Shoot barrels, they go boom. Phil next faces off against a video game programmer who was forced out of his company by his partners, and to get revenge, creates a virtual reality suit that lets him become anything he wants, including a number of totally not copyright infringement characters, including these two guys that are clearly Kung Lao in Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat, even though their presence here seems to contradict the existence of the obviously superior Mortal Wombat that we saw earlier, but oh well. The gaming convention that serves as the setting for this confrontation seems to inspire Phil, who has repeatedly had the problem of being in situations where supervillains show up, but he's unable to run home and change into his goblin gear. So he rigs up a game controller with some wireless technology that allows him to summon his goblin glider whenever he needs it, wherever he is, which is pretty damn impressive for a guy who says he knows nothing about tech. Our next story sees Goblin and Rico the Sicko get captured by the villain Arcade and brought to Arcade's Murder World, the giant underground amusement park horror land that is accurately named in that it's there to murder anyone who is captured in it. There, Gobby finds himself having to fight through the labyrinth's insane challenges in order to try and escape, which he manages to do when one of his pumpkin bombs accidentally breaks some of Arcade's equipment, allowing Phil to lead Rick to safety, which is pretty convenient. I wish it was that easy to beat Arcade's revenge, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Interestingly enough, this will turn out to be more setup for Norman Osborn's return, as Arcade was hired by this guy. In a later story, we'll reveal this mystery man to be Mindel Strom, an old business partner of Osborn's that was brought back to life by the same goblin serum that revived Norman. And it will also reveal that Norman had tasked Strom with finishing off this pretender. It's almost like they were trying to set up this Green Goblin having his main enemy be the original Green Goblin. It's really such a shame we'll never get to have a confrontation between those two. The comic comes to an end once we reach the Onslaught event. That's another event I'll probably eventually cover in its entirety, but for now I'll just say that as part of that event, Sentinels were roaming all over New York City, looking to stop anyone with superhuman powers. At first, Phil isn't interested in joining the fight, and slides under the Sentinels' radar without the mask on. But when the Daily Bugle comes briefly under attack, he realizes that whether he joins in the fight as the Goblin or not, he is still part of the fight. So he attempts to battle the nearest Sentinel to the Daily Bugle, and while those guys seem like they're often used as just pushover cannon fodder, nothing Phil throws at the Sentinel seems to even faze it. Finally, in desperation, he loads all of his explosives onto his Goblin glider and sends it at full speed straight into the Sentinel's face, which is finally enough to bring it down. While thrilled about his victory, Phil no longer has almost any of his equipment, and his mask, which served as the catalyst for activating his superpowers, was also damaged in the fight. He tries, briefly, to see if he can fight crime by wearing a ski mask and getting around on a bicycle. Quite an embarrassing moment for him. But quickly realizes he has no hope of continuing his superhero career and decides it's time to ditch it and move on with his life, never to be the Green Goblin again. At least, until a future writer comes along and has a need for him. But that's a story for another time. Right now, it's time for the breakdown. I'm not gonna lie, I do like this comic. Maybe it's just cause it was one of the first series that I was reading as it came out, and there was something cool about being part of that history to young Ramsey. But I ended up liking it so much that I made a point of collecting the entire series. Not that that's that hard to do with only 13 issues, but it's still one of only a few series I have a complete physical collection of in any form, let alone having both the single issues in the trade paperback. So yeah, I'm a fan. So maybe that and some nostalgia goggles color my opinion a bit, but I am trying to look at this as fairly as I can. I think Scott McDaniel, as I said, does a great job with the art for the series, though definitely some of the other artists I can do without. Tom DeFalco, I never considered to be that top tier of a writer, and I think a lot of his weaknesses really shine through in this series. There's definitely strong vibes of this being a series written by an adult trying very hard to be down with the kids. DeFalco attempts to appeal to Gen X with Phil's somewhat agnostic attitude towards being a hero and his general apathy and laziness, but that's not really a definition of Gen X. That's an attitude of adults going, kids these days, they have it too good, am I right? I think this causes the series to focus on a lot of the wrong things. It was trying so hard to have the Spider-Man appeal that it missed some crucial elements. It should have really focused on Phil having to struggle against a world that saw him as a villain, even while he struggled with the concept of what it means to be a hero himself. Probably Ben Urich or even Ken Ellis, or even better, Lynn Walsh, should have gone all in on trying to frame the Goblin as a supervillain, J. Jonah Jameson style, which would have forced Phil to confront his dark side. Because being persecuted for being different, being told you're not good enough no matter how hard you try, I think those are things that kids relate to in their superheroes that is simply skimmed over here. Or maybe I'm crazy. Either way, I'm giving this series a recommendation level of medium. While I do like this series, I can easily recognize that it is severely dated and does have its share of problems that will make it hard for a modern audience to read. But hey, at least it's short. The collected edition gets 1. Cute Fluffy Rat, winner of the Cute Rat Award. So fluffy, so rat. That's a fairly high ranking, in other words. I'll admit, it's pretty lacking in extras, featuring only a single piece of bonus art, but it does collect the entire 13-issue series, on top of the full issues of the 2 Spider-Man comics and the 1 Scarlet Spider comic that feature Phil's guest appearances, giving us a truly complete collection of every appearance of Green Goblin number 4 in one volume. That's pretty cool, IMO. Even if the price is a bit steep for such a relatively unknown and small-time series. Thanks everybody for watching, especially if you actually did watch the whole video. I know when I cover smaller series like this, I usually don't get too many views, but I've been wanting to cover this series for a while, and spooky season seemed like the perfect time to finally get to it. More Marvel Zombies is on its way, so if you like this video, or if you're excited about that, then be sure to click the like and subscribe and leave a comment and all that slammin' stuff, so you can help the channel out, and you can help yourself to be sure that you'll be here next time, and I hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.